Hey guys, good to be back. So last time we went over the 4 judgment processes, right? So now we're going to start on the metabolism of the perception processes. But before we get into that, I just want to quickly recap what it is that the judgment systems essentially were in order to contrast it against what the perception systems fundamentally are. So in Model 1, the J system and the P system are 2 different systems of the mind, and they both do very different things from one another. On the one hand, the J system handles very ideally structured information. So this is information that works in terms of things like rule sets and algorithms, and also in terms of logic. So, the JE system, for example, works on causality, if-then statements. It's very algorithmic. But even JI also participates in this by providing very neat, discrete categories. So it has these ideal forms. And so when you put them both together, you get this combination of axiomatic ideal discrete forms that operate with one another in these causal protocols. And the whole thing is this very neat system. You could almost call it an operating system, so to speak. So the J system works very much like software does on our computer. And this is why the interfunction dynamic between JE and JI working together is called formulation. It's very formulaic reasoning. Or the other term to describe it is ideology, because it's very ideological. And this is not necessarily ideological in the sense of like a political attitude, but it's in any sort of ideology that you have in your mind. That could be a system, a model, a theory that is held in a theoretic sense to be superimposed on reality rather than dealing with reality in its more organic state. And so this gives you a kind of blueprint for how to, let's say, navigate life, how to live your life. That's one way to think about it. Or also how to model any situation you might encounter. But of course, there's limits to this because systems are innately limited, because if you observe reality, you don't see such cleanness, right? And this gets us into what the perception system does. So the perception system takes a very different approach. Instead of handling reality through a set of rules and protocols, it simply, first of all, it starts by observing reality as we see it. And then with the observation of reality, it tries to understand it in terms of how it evolves through time. So the perception system works more so by riffing off of patterns, noticing trends, the habits that things roll with. And none of these are explicit rules, but they're just observations of the way that things evolve across time. And so thinking in terms of perception leads to much more approximation thinking, more probabilistic reasoning, more statistical understanding, more hunch-based rather than rule-based reasoning. So for the P functions, life is acknowledged as a flux. It's something that is happening all the time, but which is evolving and it's non-static, unlike axioms and rules, which are stationary in principle. So that's the role that the perception function plays in the psyche. It counterbalances the judgment process's rigidity by synthesizing information that doesn't fit into formulaic reasoning. And this is why the combined activity of both perception poles, PI and PE, is called synthesis. Or another name for the perception system is actually spatiotemporality. So what is spatiotemporality? Well, it's just a fancy way of saying volumetric space. So that would be 3 dimensions of space, but also time. So the evolution of that 3-dimensional space across time. And that is literally what it means to perceive, isn't it? So when you perceive, you see this 360-degree view evolving through time. Thus, perception equals spatiotemporality. It's very straightforward and rather obvious when you think about it. Now, given that perception is our comprehension of this space and time volume, I want to start first by tackling PI, which is introverted perception. To do that, I first want to rewind back the clock to how our perception first formed when we were just starting out in this life. So here on screen, I have a little looping GIF. This is a very famous paper. It's a Piaget experiment. So if you look what's happening in this image, there's the baby and there's the cat, and then there are the cups. And the baby is playing with the cups, putting them over the cat. As the baby is putting the cups over the cat, she runs out of cups, and then she goes back to grab another one that she understood was there, even though it was out of the line of sight. So there are a lot of cognitive operations happening, including the use of JI to identify objects and JE to understand their causal relations. But for this video, I want to focus on one thing in particular, which is object permanence. So object permanence is the understanding that an object continues to exist even when it cannot be heard, seen, or touched directly. And this capacity typically develops in babies at around the ages of 4 to 7 months. So it's around this same age that they also become fascinated with the peekaboo game, right? Which is a different play on this idea. So at this age, this baby already understands object permanence, but it begs a deeper question, a philosophical question, right? Like, how is it that we know something is there when we can't see it directly? Because it's not obvious that that would be the case. And the reason why we can do this is because of PI, introverted perception. Why? Because PI is actually the perception of objects that are not there immediately, but which are stored in a kind of internal map of the world. It is a kind of second world above the world that is actually physically within our optical field of view. So in a way, each of us exists in kind of two planes. We are here present, but then we also exist within a mental space that has its own mapping, and that allows us to see occluded objects. For example, if something is behind my computer and I know what it is, I have a sense that it's there even though I can't see it. And this idea of having an internal map has been essential to our recent developments in AI, such as in self-driving cars. And really, I think that's because it accurately mirrors how our cognition works with our own introverted perception process. So for anybody who's driven in a Tesla before, you'll be familiar with this screen here. This is the UI display that shows the cars around you. Now, this is a representation that is extracted from the camera. So here are the cameras. And what's interesting about this map is that the map sees more than what the raw cameras do. And that's because the maps are designed to account for occlusion. So for example, if you have a scenario like here where this red car goes behind this white van, the cameras can no longer pick up on the red car. But the car, in order to do the self-driving correctly, it needs to know that the car still exists behind the van. So in this frame is here, this frame is here, this frame is here, and then it's just gone. But if you know the frames prior, you know that the car should be there. So even though you're not seeing it here, because in the past you saw the car, in the past frames, you saw the car there, you know that the car is still there. And this is what's called episodic memory. So it allows us to perceive what is not there presently, but which is stored in a kind of spatial and temporal map or a worldview, which is why the PI function is called time, but also called worldview. They are both two sides of the same coin. Time relates to the temporal component, and worldview relates to the spatial component. Now, so far, I've described PI in the most rudimentary way possible using physical or concrete environmental examples. However, as we're going to see very soon, PI is about much more than just the topography. It actually maps any sort of information in relational coordinates, whether that's abstract or concrete. And some people are much better at the abstract capacity than the concrete capacity, which actually brings me to the idea of abstraction in the first place. So years ago, I used to use the word concrete to refer to S and abstract to refer to N as synonyms, but this turned out to not be a very good word choice. All the 8 functions are actually abstract in nature. They all deal with abstract objects, and so they can all be represented abstractly. And concretion of thinking has more to do with early developmental stages, and abstraction has more to do with later developmental stages. So let me explain. Here I have 4 age ranges, right? And then you see here a graph with more concrete on one side and more abstract on the other side. So as development happens in the human being, the capacity for higher abstraction is unlocked. So let me walk you through really quickly of how this would happen. So here, beginning with the pre-verbal infant. So this child doesn't yet have language, but he understands the basics of object permanence, which means that if they leave a red toy in the kitchen, and they want the toy, they might understand mentally, I need to go get it, so it's over there. But it's really still very closely tied to the concrete reality, because ultimately it's an analog of the concrete world that is stored in their mind. That's how it starts out with infants. Okay, so now we move on to another phase along this process. This is, let's say, a child who's maybe 4 or 5 years old. Now they understand language. So now they have symbolic structures. And so for a child of this age, you might be able to tell them something like, I left my yellow rain boots in the garage. Can you please go get them for me? And the boy might go into the garage, understand the command, go look for them, find them, and bring them back to you. And so here we're already dealing with a very abstract understanding, but notice it is all still spatial temporal. They are actually still localizing garage. Garage is a space. Yellow boots are an object in space, and they understand these symbols as referring to spatial coordinates and objects in spatial coordinates. However, going a little further, it starts to become a little more abstract. And at this point, you're more abstract than concrete. So this kid might be, let's say, late middle school, early high school, and he's being taught information in class. Let's say that he learns that Christopher Columbus sailed the Atlantic Ocean to reach the Americas. So here, things are more abstract because the kid probably has no direct experience with 1492 or Christopher Columbus. These are words that don't have a direct analog that his lived experience has embodied. So what's happening here? How is it that a spatial temporal coordinate system can do something like remember in 1492, Christopher Columbus sailed the Atlantic Ocean? Well, this is because what was first a system perception used to track topological coordinate information has since been repurposed by human cognition to track coordinates in abstract landscapes as humans evolved. So you see that understanding the phrase in 1492, Christopher Columbus sailed the Atlantic Ocean is not that different from understanding that your red truck is in the other room. It's fundamentally the same thing, just extrapolated in the abstract space. Now, over time, this develops even further to where once you reach, let's say, college level, you can understand much more highly sophisticated abstract ideas, such as, for example, quotes like this one here. I'll save you the trouble of reading it, but needless to say that in order to understand an idea like this one about the New Deal and its place in society and the economy, you have to have mapped a lot of different sort of phenomenon in the real world and have a broad worldview that includes many different sort of layers of data. And at this point, you're dealing with information that has become so abstracted that it's really hard to even see that it came originally from a coordinate system mapping. But it is still coming from a coordinate system mapping because all this data is still relationally connected. But in order for that to make sense, we really have to kind of evolve our view of what this coordinate system does to more so think about it in terms of these abstract dimensional semantic layers rather than strictly topological layers. And so if we're looking at this kind of general data storage device that can handle any kind of information, in order to understand this metaphorically, we have to bring in another device that can also map any sort of relational data. And so a great tool to help us illustrate how this encoding is working is the concept of latent spaces, which can handle all kinds of information forms. It can be graphical, it could be auditory, or it could be abstract, it could be numerical. Any sort of data can be mapped in a latent space. So latent spaces essentially make use of Euclidean coordinates in order to track different concepts and how they are similar or different to each other. So in this map here, you have light in the center, and then around light, there are different clusters of related words to light. And within the clusters, you have similar words in that cluster. So that all around you form this space that is divided in a proximal or distal way, what relationship terms have to each other. So for example, down here, the word stormy is pretty close to the word rainy, which makes sense, but it's somewhat far away from light. But light is actually close to bright. So this is what we might call a semantic dimension. And these semantic dimensions store relational information in an abstract manner. So given that, imagine trying to, say, find a word in your head. This is a word that you are already familiar with. It's just, you just can't remember it. It's on the tip of your tongue. You're scowling at the ground, trying to recall. And so as you do this, it suddenly hits you, musty. The word is musty. So basically what was happening in your mind, even though you weren't visualizing it this way, is you were scanning around the area for words like foggy, and you were hitting rainy, stormy, and suddenly you hit musty, right? So that's what was happening. And then you're like, aha, that's the one. So the mainly graphical origins of the system, which is topographical, would scowl to search intensely for things. And then when that became abstracted, we still scowl intensely for things, even though we're searching latent spaces now instead of graphical spaces. And so that's why we have this evolution of PI, which is exactly what I said about from going from infants to going to adolescence and then going to college student level. That's how we get from topology to abstract latent spaces. And this is what leads me to a more general description of what PI does. And so here we have these three examples: topological coordinates, which relates to more concrete spatial-temporal mapping, graphical in nature. And then you have your latent space historical coordinates, where you have concepts that connect to each other in relation to historical events that are relevant. And then a latent space map that is word association based, similar to the ones that Carl Jung would have people explore. So all these three are metabolically equivalent. They are all equally using PI, which is a more general process, using it in different manners. And like before with JI and JE, here again we see a diagram illustrating various other ways in which PI could manifest when paired with other cognitive faculties. And again, this isn't a complete map of all the different ways it can manifest, but it's just to help illustrate the various ways in which PI can express itself. So you have the aforementioned topographical orientation over here, but over here on this side you have history and anthropology, which happens when you combine together PI's coordinate system with the language centers or the semantic centers to create a kind of semantic memory, which gives you history. And we've seen this a lot in our lecture series so far, right? We saw that there was a high leaning in PI users, the PI samples, towards history and academia and subjects that require vast knowledge base, things like anthropology and sociology and so forth. At the same time, it's clear that a PI isn't just about memory, or at least insofar as it is about memory, it's a specific kind of memory. It's about retaining relational coordinates, the kind of memory that retains relational coordinates between data sets. That's the key kind of memory that it is, not in general having a lot of memory storage. So to summarize, PI preserves relational coordinates between data sets in a mental grid or map. But these data sets can be of any sort because the grid is generalized. So that's PI. Now we're going to take a look at the two different expressions of PI metabolism, and that would be SI and NI, beginning first with SI. The word I use for SI is locality. Now, we just made it clear that for PI, it's a general ability of PI to track the location of objects relative to each other. So we see both SI and NI make use of placements or locations. However, when I say locality, I don't mean it in that general sense, but in a very specific technical sense. And it implies a certain nature to information. And so to get a better sense of how this term is used in CT, I want to draw an analogy to how the term is used in physics. So reading here from Wikipedia, in physics, the principle of locality states that an object is influenced directly only by its immediate surroundings. A theory that includes the principle of locality is said to be a local theory, and this is an alternative to the concept of instantaneous non-local action at a distance. So you see, essentially, the principle of locality necessitates that objects within a grid, in this case, the three-dimensional grid that is reality, can only be influenced by the adjacent parts within that grid. So if something is right next to you, up, down, left, right, forward, back, past, or future, immediately next to you, then it could have an influence on that event. And the opposite would be that things could happen without having direct adjacency. And this is very close to what CT means by locality, except instead of strictly speaking about topographical space, this three-dimensional space, only being influenced directly by adjacent objects, we're also talking about the informational form spaces that we talked about, the semantic dimensions, also only being influenced by adjacent data points. So here I have a few symbolic points on a grid. And with SI locality, you can't get from point A to point C without traveling through point B here, or in some way around point B through a series of more points that equally connect the two together. So one way or another, you're not getting from A to C without either going through B or going through a bunch of other points which connect you linearly from A to C. In other words, you can't just teleport from A to C. There has to be some sort of informational bridge from point A to C, whether it's B or something else. So that's what is meant by locality. And again, this applies to physical spaces, but it also applies to informational spaces. So informational steps that get you from A to C are also honoring this principle of locality. So what this means is that for SI, the nature of information, the ontology of information is localized, and it has a very faithful relationship based on proximity. Proximity is the key word here. But then by necessity, the inverse is also true for SI, which means that if two data sets are not literally adjacent, spatially or conceptually, that SI it doesn't automatically acknowledge the connection or that there's any connection at all. And this is part of what leads to SI's famous behavioral emergences, such as the fact-checking and the skepticism. The fact-checking is making sure that there is a traceable line from, let's say, a premise and a conclusion, or a traceable line between a story adding up together without gaps in the story. So if somebody were trying to say A, then L, A, then L, and SI will notice the discrepancy here because in their inner map, A and L are not literally adjacent concepts. So they'll say, well, what do you mean? Like, how did you get to that point? I don't understand how you're drawing that conclusion or how you're making that connection. And so SI is very keen to notice these gaps, especially when other people might be overlooking them. Now, I have to say also, though, that of course, an SI user has no problem following along with a far-fetched idea and just understanding the idea. There's no lack of ability to hold in the mind an idea, a speculation that doesn't require literal adjacency to it. They just won't see that idea as being valid at the ontological level. It doesn't really mean it's real to them. They will see it as a speculation, but they'll see it as a hypothetical or an imagination or a fiction. And we see this tendency very much in the aforementioned Sabine Hossenfelder, who, aside from the book Lost in Math, she also has a YouTube channel that is very much about debunking pseudoscience, criticizing a lot of dumb things that people believe, whether it's about physics itself or whether it's about biology and chemistry or what have you. So she's an excellent example of the SI skepticism. Another infamous SI user, of course, is Richard Dawkins with his books like The God Delusion, and he also constantly criticizes people who conflate ideas together that shouldn't be conflated. And we can also look at others like Steven Novella here, who's also a high SI user. With his books, he has several books, but some of them like The Skeptic's Guide to the Universe. I love the subtitle, How to Know What's Really Real in a World Increasingly Full of Fake. Now, whenever anybody says really real, they're talking about their ontological bias. So in this case, really real is the verification of informational adjacency that is native to his SI. Now, I really should say something about this though, because my examples just now were very atheistic leaning, but I need to clarify that I'm not saying that SI necessarily lends to atheism. We did see in our lecture series so far several SI users that were religious, such as, for example, Paul Ederson and Frank Turek. But we did also notice that those SI users that are more religious tend to be more fundamentalist. They tend to be more traditionalist in their religious beliefs on average. So why is that? Well, it's because their belief is tied, let's say, to some factual belief in the Bible, some historicity to the Bible, the crucifixion, or whatever tradition they come from. There's the belief in these things in a literal way that is happening, that happened through space-time. By contrast, when we see God-believing NI users, especially the high NI users, this tends to have a more esoteric feel to it. So often God is believed more in a broader sense and a broader definition than binding it down to one's particular tradition that happened in one particular literal space and time. So when I say that SI is inclined towards skepticism, this doesn't mean that they necessarily land on a position of disbelief about something. They may very well believe in that something, but it's always through an A to L mapping of the sequence that leads to that belief. And then actually, once they've mapped that sequence, they can be very adamant believers of that thing. Now, while SI is called locality, NI is called translocality, which works in a similar way to SI because they're both PI functions, but it works in the opposite direction as locality. And I'll explain the name translocality a bit more in a second. But first, we need to dive deeper into the differences between S and N. As we spoke previously in the lecture series, S can be thought of as literal information, while N is about associative information. But we need to unpack this even further now that we're talking about information metabolism. So in CT, the N operation is association or intersection, and it's represented by a Venn diagram. The overlapping area of the Venn diagram is the associative range, and then the non-overlapping areas are the areas of differences. And in this diagram, I have the same idea, but in different form. So here you see these two matrices, and the points that are similar between the two matrices are those that overlap. So if this was an array or two arrays, then the numbers shared by both arrays would be the intersection area. Now, as with all cognitive operations, they come with an ontological status. In the case of N, the similarity or overlap here is given the higher status. So things are validated if they have commonality, and the differences are less validated. For example, if you take the case of dogs and wolves, you can make a Venn diagram like this. Now, let's examine the statement, dogs are wolves, right? This statement, dogs are wolves, highlights the intersection point as the most defining status while depreciating the differences. Or one could say, well, actually, in some cases, they can actually interbreed, and therefore they are still essentially one species at the core. The associative view takes the facts that there is an overlap as a means to equate the two things together. Oppositely, the discrete S view takes the fact that there's some non-overlapping area as a means to distinguish the two things from each other. Now, it's worth noting that both of these views are missing something from the picture. So it's not entirely right to say that dogs are wolves or that dogs are not wolves, since they both are or are not, depending on what is meant. And this is why we all have both an N and an S function. Since they're both correct in their own way, everything is in some way related to something else, and everything is distinct from anything else. And in the absolute sense, actually, nothing, no object, is exactly like any other object. And thus, in the absolute sense, the S perspective is actually correct. But on the other hand, all objects are like all other objects in the sense that they share a fundamental substrate. And we know this now by looking at things like subatomic particles, for example. And so the extreme view of the N process would say that everything is everything else. You, me, the tree, the planet itself, we are all one because we are all, let's say, stardust. That is one romantic view that is taken sometimes to kind of justify this ontology. And now this statement may not be technically incorrect, but the poetics, the romantics of that statement highlights the similarities and neglects the differences, you see. So that's what the N operation is in its bias fundamentally. So now that we've taken this detour to define the N operation in more detail, let's go back now to defining what NI is. So here you see on screen two very simplified maps, one representing SI and one representing NI. Now on the SI map, you see there are these solid circles representing discrete data points. And so they have definite locations. But on the right-hand side, you see these sort of dotted, broader circles symbolizing a more general zone rather than a discrete point. They're not entirely specific in their location, but this isn't the whole view of the representation I want to make here. Because if you turn the NI map at an angle about 3/4, now we look and what we see is that those dotted circles are actually holes that connect to other map layers such that the object, the circle here, for example, this one at the top here, is actually one that cuts across multiple layers. So the location of the object is actually in multiple locations at once. And although I can't animate this for you at the moment, just imagine if you were to take, for example, one of these dots like this one here and move it up or down a little bit, that dot would move up or down in all three of these layers because they would co-vary because it's the same object being moved across these layers, which means that the whole structure would move, including layers that are unrelated to the present layer because they are associatively related. And this is the same idea as the Venn diagram that we just saw earlier. So here we have the two graphics next to each other, which are really the same graphic. So what this means is that every time a certain object is registered on NI's map, it is actually pulling up a general object that intersects various other layers or dimensions and which doesn't strictly belong to that particular context or layer. That means that, for example, as NI perceives the situation, it is actually perceiving a symbol that is actually dislocated from the immediate present. Well, dislocated isn't actually the right word. It's more that it is located, but just across multiple layers. There isn't a single layer in the NI worldview that isn't in some ways connected to other layers via isomorphisms like this. And this is where I finally want to talk about the name translocality for NI. Now, as with all the functions so far, and the alias that they all have, it shouldn't be taken too literally, but the alias translocality for NI also draws on some general inspiration from the physics concept of quantum non-locality. Now in physics, quantum non-locality refers to the way in which some effects appear to influence each other at a distance. So for example, with entanglement, right? So these particles are not literally adjacent, and yet they still share some mysterious connection, allowing them to influence each other without direct touching, without direct contact. And this is very different, as we said, with SI locality, which requires for information to connect directly in order for it to be transmitted. And so you can see the obvious connection here, because NI translocality is very much like quantum non-locality in the sense that disparate points are connected by associativity across these adjacent layers, the same way that quantum entanglement allows for effects to influence at a distance without locally touching. Great, okay, so that explains the name of NI as well as the nature of association and isomorphism. But we're just beginning to unpack this structure. So the next part of this I want to explain is the relationship between the coordinates. So remember, part of PI is in tracking the location of coordinates, right? That's what we went through so far. However, another part of PI is understanding the relationship between the coordinates in a map. So what you see here on screen is the same coordinate connections between an SI map and an NI map, except in the NI map, because, as we said, each one of these dots is not really just a dot, it's an isomorphism, then you're actually seeing a structure that is a relational structure between isomorphisms. And any specific moment in time is viewed as a relationship between those general ideas. So let me explain this by way of a series of examples. As you see here, these images right here. The first image depicts a poor woman pleading to a king or a nobleman. The second image here is of a sinner praying to Jesus Christ. The third image here is, I believe, Brother Juniper and a beggar. The fourth image here appears to be a confession of love or some sort of appeal or plea. And the fifth image is a marriage proposal from a nobleman to a woman. So the composition above is an example of 5 scenes which share an isomorphic map, right? So you can see in the first scene, in the second scene, third scene, fourth scene, and fifth scene, they all share a commonality to them, which can be symbolically represented through this thread that is connecting, for example here, the heads of all the people that are a higher position versus this thread which connects the people that are in a lowly position, making supplication to that higher position individual of some sort, whether it's a love appeal, perhaps an appeal for money, or an appeal to be saved in terms of their health or their life. There's a general range of things that can apply in this structure, right? It can apply to different situations, and the context could be quite different, and yet the structure still holds. Again, we're looking at the similarities, not the differences. And so when an NI recall is generated, the recall will call forth a series of things connected in that thread that relate to the moment, even if they're different in their context, and it'll see the present moment through the lens of that general act. So the general archetypal context of someone higher up that you admire and plead towards, make supplication towards when you're the lowly one, that structure and whatever is isomorphic to that structure is what is brought into memory, and that is what is dealt with in the moment. The present moment is contextualized through that thread. So you see here that this set of 5 images is the same diagram really as the one here with our grid map. NI doesn't store information in these fixed locations, but it stores the information in the general relationships between these isomorphic shapes. And this way of thinking is, of course, what gives NI this proclivity to think in terms of archetypes. And indeed, Carl Jung himself was an NI user, so it's no surprise that he would popularize this term archetype, as it is very much the way that his own mind, his own consciousness conceptualizes things. And it's no surprise also why there's a connection between the NI users in a database and the use of tools like the tarot. The tarot is actually a deck of cards that are all essentially archetypal situations or episodes. They're not just characters all the time, they're actually scenarios. There's these eternal patterns manifesting itself in the here and now, but which transcends the here and now, and you find it in the past and you will find it in the future. Which brings me actually to the second aspect of NI. We have yet to talk about time. Everything I've mentioned so far relates to the space component of NI, where things are spatially translocal or cutting across different spaces. But the time dimension of NI is also translocal, or better yet said, transtemporal. And this has the additional effect that objects which are isomorphic but are separated across time, across the time dimension, are still essentially the same object. Now, but see, this creates a dilemma, because if that is true, then, as we said before, that there's a co-influence, because it's the same object and it's cutting across different layers, then if you move it here, it also moves here. Well, if they're separated by space and also by time, then adjusting an object in the present might affect its past and its future, or vice versa. The future and the past can affect the present. And this gives NI's ontological bias a level of freedom when it comes to the fundamentality of chronology, in the sense that we don't just jump across space in isomorphisms, we also jump across time with isomorphisms as well. This essentially yields temporal isomorphisms. And I'm going to be explaining this in two ways. So the first implication we might draw from this idea of temporal isomorphisms is that two events separated by distance, but which are connected in form, are actually really the same event. And so you might already recognize this idea if you've studied Carl Jung, because this is none other than a synchronicity. So in our grid diagram here, you can see that, let's say these two layers are different spatial regions, right? Let's say one is in New York and one is in Paris here. And then something happens in New York, and that can have an immediate influence on what happens in Paris if the events share a congruence or an isomorphism. So if you take this diagram and instead of thinking of it in terms of associated concepts, you think of it as associated events, then that is none other than the concept of synchronicity generated out of the same diagram. So the concept of synchronicity was developed by Carl Jung, who was an NI user, and he discussed and developed this idea extensively with Wolfgang Pauli, who I believe was also an NI user, if not an NI lead. And so it's no surprise that these two gentlemen would try to develop out the idea of synchronicity, given that they're both high NI users. So let's unpack this a little bit. So events that happen simultaneously across distances, but which don't have a traceable causal connection, are still meaningfully linked together instead of randomly or arbitrarily linked together. In other words, there's a kind of orchestrated congruence that is happening at the universal level somehow. And individuals like Carl Jung struggled to articulate exactly what force might be at play making this happen. But regardless of how you quantify whatever's making this occur, it's just an observation that they do occur, that synchronicities happen. And this is what leads to some thinkers like Rupert Sheldrake asserting that telepathic phenomena may be real. He tries to measure telepathy via a sort of synchronicity. For example, one of his experiments measures this sense that some people have that the phone is about to ring, when they have this thought, this sensation that it's about to ring, and then suddenly the phone rings, which is a kind of synchronicity, right? Time, temporal isomorphisms. Somebody's thinking about calling, and then you get the sense that someone's about to call. That is a temporal isomorphism, aka synchronicity. And remember how we talked about how NI doesn't necessarily subscribe to a chronological view of time. They usually NI users do, like if you meet 20 NI users, most of them will say, well, yeah, chronological time it exists, but it's more out of habituation. It's more from the exposure of life over time. It's told you that the past comes before and the present and the future comes later, but there isn't any fundamental reason why that would be, and sometimes it might shift. Sometimes that could be different. And indeed, if anything, for NI, there is some level of push for time being more fluid in its influence of the past, present, and future, since past and future are localities, right? And translocality connects past and future together, if that makes sense. All right, so I told you that there would be two aspects to describing the view of time for NI. We just went through the first one, which is synchronicities. Now I want to mention the second aspect, and that is cycles, because another way of reframing the same concept of NI is NI can be thought of as isomorphisms, that's N, unfolding across time, that's PI, right? So we have an isomorphism that repeats across time, and the simplest example of this is actually a wave. So here on screen you see a cosine wave, and you see here there is one wave here and one wave there. These two waves are isomorphic to each other, but they are displaced along the time axis. So one is in the past and one is in the future. And of course, the cosine wave is in reality a circle, that's pi, which has been stretched over the x-axis. So a wave equals a circle, and a wave/circle is an isomorphic pattern recurring across time. And this is basically another way of describing NI's ontological bias as isomorphisms unfolding across time. And more so, it treats the ontology of these patterns as singular, meaning it is the same wave, the same thread, the same archetype, the same cycle, interpermeating various layers of space and time. It has one ontology that is translocal and transtemporal. That is the NI ontological bias. And these geometries between circles and cycles, very aptly captures how NI thinks. So much so that you will actually see a lot of NI users representing their thought process graphically through this sort of symbology, because NI is spatial temporal, so it's graphical in nature, right? So if it tries to embody its thought process in symbolism, it often expresses itself as representations of cyclical forms that are happening in a geometric space. So this is what gives rise to NI's association with sacred geometry, for example, as well as the mandalas, which Carl Jung was such a fan of. So you see all these things are coming together now. They're all emerging from the same basic, simple definition of NI as isomorphic patterns unfolding across time. And this is also why NI is associated with let's say a greater than average proclivity or inclination towards acausal but cyclical instruments such as astrology, or concepts like karma, which are also about cyclical phenomenon, where the past, the karma, catches up to you in the present out of some sort of connection between past and present, again, associatively cutting across time layers. And more broadly, it's also why NI is associated with more Eastern theological viewpoints, such as those that include reincarnation, which is an isomorphic cycle manifesting itself across time. It's the same, let's say, rendition, the same person repeating across time. But again, I have to back up here a bit and say that these are just the effects that result from NI's ontology when it's taken to the extreme, right? In the same way that I was describing the ontology of FE or FI and how it expresses itself when taken to the extreme, I'm also describing here NI when you really believe this inclination, this implicit bias. But not everybody, not even all NI users, have to believe it this overtly. In fact, it as a simple processing apparatus, NI doesn't necessarily incline itself towards these specific beliefs, but more so it'll just incline a person more towards associative thinking and generalizations of phenomena, rather than focusing so much on specific phenomena. All right, and that covers NI. Now you may have noticed that I spoke a lot more about NI than I did about SI. And that's because, like FE, NI affirms more ontological properties. So in general, the N and the F functions affirm a broader range of ontological baselines, while both S and T are more particular or selective in what they validate. So naturally, it takes a lot longer to cover the many different ways that NI affirms its expressions. But okay, so that about wraps up our initial introduction into the PI functions, SI and NI. The next video will be about the PE functions. So I'm very excited to see you guys in that video. Thank you guys for watching, and I hope to see you again soon. Bye.